I would like to welcome you all to the 6th webinar in our new webinar series. Our presenter today is Vicki Hollet, a teacher, teacher trainer, and more recently, a video producer. She is an award-winning author of many popular ELT books published by University Press and Pearson. Her key interests are pragmatics and sociolinguistics, business and technical English, ELF, and video. She writes 2 blogs and runs the Simple English Videos website for learners. A Brit by birth, she now lives in the U.S., where for the last 14 years she has been learning to speak Merican. And this webinar would not be possible today without our tech hosts. I would like to thank Mercedes Viola, Heike Philp, Matt Hausdorff, and Justina Arena for their technical help today. If you have questions, please write it into the Q&A pod on the screen, which will be below the slides, instead of into the chat box. At the end, Vicki will endeavor to answer as many questions as possible. We will make the slides available for 1 week on the IATEFL website. They will then be moved to the archives for members to view along with the recording. As website updates are done by the IATEFL head office, both the slides and recording will not be available until next week. And now over to you, Vicki.
Or where a common greeting is the word yo. So, yo, what's up? And could you repeat after me, please? If you can hear me and my sound is okay, could you just type a yo in the chat for me? I hope that oh, good. I hope I'm coming through clear. Yo! Lovely. I'm British, but I've been living in the United States now for nearly 15 years and learning to speak Merican. And Americans in the audience, there are so many variations of American English, of course. And so I'm going to generalize because I come from Philadelphia now. So please forgive me, and you'll have to correct me when I get things wrong. Because remember, I'm only learning to speak Merican. My friends at work say I'm about intermediate. Canadians, South Americans, my apologies in advance. For want of a better term, I'm going to use the term Americans to refer to the inhabitants of the USA. And also British people in the audience, I'm going to call you Brits. It's just become a habit. I hope you'll forgive me. It's a quick form. And I'm going to be focused here on British and American, and I wish I knew more about Irish varieties and South African varieties and Australian and Kiwi and Indian and all the rest. So please invite me over there so I can learn about them too. But in the meantime, this will be primarily about British and American. And of course, there are differences in pronunciation and grammar and lexis and vocabulary between British and American English. But in this talk, I'm mostly going to talk about the thing that's been the biggest learning curve for me, how my thoughts need to be structured differently in American. And to my mind, the most difficult trickiest differences occur in the nature of the discourse. Let me give you an example. My British publisher was visiting the US and he was having dinner with us, and he said to my American husband, Jay, can you tell me the rules of cricket? Sorry, of baseball. And Jay said, oh, it's really very simple. And I thought, well, no way is this going to be simple. And sure enough, I heard Jay begin a really complicated account of all the rules of baseball. And then he said to my editor, Barnaby, now what about cricket? Could you tell me what the rules of cricket are? And then I heard Barnaby saying, oh, it's rather complicated, I'm afraid. But complicated or not, it didn't stop him into launching into rules of equal complexity. So both were being polite and friendly, but in very different ways. And what we're looking at here is 2 different ways of showing courtesy and consideration. The American aiming to include, and the Brit apologizing for the imposition. And it's this structuring of the discourse that goes on all the time. And for my thoughts to be received well in the United States, I have to frame them differently. And so much of what I'm going to be talking about here is actually related to politeness and also to pragmatics. And pragmatics, as George Ewell memorably described it, is the study of invisible meaning. It's a relatively young branch of linguistics, and it's about how we get meaning from context to understand people's intentions. Or not, of course. And it's more about the relationship between the linguistic forms and the users of the language. So it's not so much about semantics or syntax, but about the relationship between the forms and the users of the language. Lane Cole over at the Macmillan Dictionary blog gave a wonderful example of this with a story of a job she had. Now, Lane grew up in South Africa, but she found herself sharing an office with 2 Brits and an American, and they were all getting to know one another. And one day her new American colleague took her aside and said, "Do you understand what those 2 Brits are saying?" And she said, "Well, yes, I do, but perhaps it's because I'm more used to the British accent." And he said, "No," he said, "it's not their accent, it's that they don't seem to say what they mean." And that reminds me of my other favourite definition of pragmatics, which is it's the study of how we don't say what we mean. So, some nice examples here of some people not saying what they mean. If I say to you, "Were you raised in a barn?" do I really mean, "Were you raised in a barn?" Or what else do I mean? Any suggestions? What does "were you raised"? When might I say "were you raised in a barn"? Where are your manners? Exactly. Close the door. Yes. It's the sort of thing we would say, isn't it, when somebody hasn't closed the door and we're cross. Let me give you another example. "Would you like to come up and see my etchings?" Does it really mean, "Would you like to come up and see my etchings"? Well, no, of course not. It means something like, "Let's make love." And another one, "Nice store you've got here. It'd be a shame if anything happened to it." Now, of course, the person who is saying this is going to provide the meaning. If it's a mafia, a member of the mafia, or somebody doing some extortion on a small shopkeeper, the meaning of this is quite clearly not "nice store you've got here," but "pay me my money," isn't it? And this is one of my favorites. It comes from Michael Swan. And he says that this one could mean all sorts of things. Obviously, there's a lot of ambiguity always built into things like this. But in this case, it could be something like, "Don't get drunk and start flirting with Melissa again." So now, the meaning here is being conveyed more than by just the words spoken. The context provides a lot of the information. People don't have to speak directly because who is talking to who and where they are is making their intentions clear. And there's a curious thing about this, which is indirectness has benefits. If I said to you, "Would you like me to seduce you?" is a lot more threatening than "Would you like to see my etchings?" And "let's not have a repetition of last time" means less embarrassment all around. We don't have to mention Melissa again. So it's masking our intentions, hints, innuendos, indirectness, notice that these things can fulfill a social function, and there are often social benefits to being indirect. Now, as teachers, this is an issue because our students want to be direct. We try to help them to be direct so that their meanings can be crystal clear. But actually, human beings are often very indirect. And it's not just examples like this. What's surprising when you look at talk, when you look at what people say, is how frequent these sorts of indirect acts are. If I say to you, those biscuits look nice, I might be commenting on the appearance of the biscuits, but it's much more likely that I would be saying, well, you tell me in the chat, can you? If somebody says those biscuits look nice, what do they probably mean? Give me one, please. Exactly. Yes. Can I have one? That's right. Yes. Would anyone like some more wine? Oh, that's a lovely example, Craig. Of course, what it really means is, I want some more wine. Can I have some? It's rather like this one. Is anybody else here feeling hot? Usually means I feel hot. Have you finished with that newspaper? I mean, why would we ask that question except unless we wanted to borrow it, probably? Are you going past a postbox on your way home? This would be a very strange question to ask unless we really meant, I want you to post a letter. And what's interesting about this is how pervasive these things are in speech. I mean, look at this one, right? How often do we say this? So often. And of course, what it really means is, can I have some attention? I need your help. So notice that these statements are all ambiguous. They could mean one thing, they could mean another. So on the surface, it could mean, I like the appearance of these biscuits, but in reality, it's more likely, but it's possible. I mean, there's this ambiguity built into them. And this ambiguity has social benefits, because if you want to give me a biscuit, then life is going to be more pleasant for you and for me. And I can get what I want without you having to say no. And people don't like saying no. No is what sociolinguists would refer to as the dispreferred response. So I might say, those biscuits look nice, hoping you'll offer me one. And then if you say, yes, I bought them for my children's school, then I can say, oh, how old are your children now? And we can both pretend that I never asked. No damage done. Now, people say that Americans are very direct, but I'm not sure how true that is. Americans have a reputation for calling a spade a spade. But if you look at those phrases again, you don't have to make many changes for them to work in American. You just change a little bit of vocabulary, and Americans could say those things too. And they're seem to be, to me, just as likely as me to make requests like these in this roundabout fashion. So this directness myth doesn't hold up, I think. And it doesn't hold up when you look at American corporate speak. You know, since I've been here, customers no longer have problems with products. We have issues. People don't ask me for information. They reach out to me. And people don't lie. They are economical with the truth. And I'm not saying that Brits aren't just as guilty of employing euphemisms like this, but it makes me wonder where Americans get their reputation for directness from. And I think it's a bit of a mystery, but I think it comes from two different aspects of politeness, two sides of the coin going on here. Generally speaking, American English employs more positive politeness. Being considerate and courteous involves including people, showing warmth and approval, friendliness. And the stereotype of the garrulous American who gives you a rundown of their entire life history within the first few minutes of meeting them is rooted in this. It's just not polite to hold back. You have to share and be open. Meanwhile, British English employs more negative politeness. Being kind and considerate and courteous means not imposing on people, not intruding on them, letting them go about their business without getting in their way. And the stereotype of the aloof, standoffish Brit who won't talk to anybody in a railway carriage is rooted in that. It's polite to leave people alone so they can go about their business without your getting in their way. So in the UK, we're more likely to show respect to people by ignoring them. And in America, folks will show respect by including them. And this is rather a crude description, but when I moved to the United States, one of the things I had to learn to do was to stop saying sorry so much and start saying thank you more. So cut down on the apologies for imposition and start showing more appreciation. It's a little bit more complicated than that with thank you, and you can ask me about it at the end if you like, but roughly, as a rule of thumb, that was kind of what was going on. Now, I'm using the terms positive and negative here in a very technical sense. It's not that American politeness is good and British politeness is bad. They're just different, you know, like sides of electricity can be positive and negative. A current of electricity, and it doesn't mean that it's good or bad. It's just a difference that arises between both, that's important in both cultures. And what we've got going on here is positive and negative politeness is important in both American and British English. It's just a slightly different weighting that we give it here. And it's positive and negative politeness are going on in all cultures as well. And different cultures tend to accord them different weightings. It's a universal human dilemma, you know? Competing politeness principles put us on the spot. We have to be warm, open and approving, but at the same time we have to avoid imposing. And it's led to one of my biggest challenges in the United States, and that is how to handle compliments. It's really tricky. And I don't just have to handle them, I actually have to teach them here sometimes. You know, if you pick up an American course book, quite often they're there in the list of functions, just in the same way as you'd find requests and offers and thank yous and all that sort of thing in a British course book. And it's really tricky for me. You know, if I do someone a very small favour, they will say, "Oh, you're awesome." And being British, I feel compelled to say, no, it was no trouble. And Americans will think, well, that's odd, you know. And it's also very confusing for me because compliments are frequently used as an invitation to talk here. So it's rather like we might say, "Oh, nice day today, isn't it?" in British English. So perfect strangers will make compliments, pay compliments like, "I love your accent," or "your earrings," or "your eyes," or something. And I have to keep reminding myself it's just a different ritual. In the UK and other negative politeness cultures, compliments are dished out more sparingly. The thing is, they could be an imposition, because the person receiving them might think, "What right have you got to make a judgment about me?" Or they might feel obliged to pay you a compliment back, so it could look like you're fishing for a compliment yourself. And so how to respond to compliments, switch on, So how to respond to compliments has been a real problem for me. Okay, say someone comes up to me at the end of a talk and they say something like, "Wow, Vicki, I loved your presentation." Now, as a Brit, if they start saying things like, "It was awesome," I'm going to feel compelled to say something. What would I have to say as a Brit? Brit, help me out here. Brits, help me out here. I'd have to say something. I'll carry on. I'll have to say something like, "Oh, it's very kind of you to say so, but I wish I'd done a better job." Something like that, okay? Because otherwise I could appear big-headed, you know? And that's going to be difficult for the American, because they're going to have to come back and say something to me like, "No, it was really good." But then I'm going to have to say something like, "Oh, no, I forgot a lot of stuff. I was too nervous." And then they're going to have to say, "I really didn't notice. I thought it was terrific." And then I'm going to have to say, "Oh, really, I should have practiced more." And it's all going to get horribly embarrassing. And at the end of it, I'm going to want to crawl under a table with embarrassment. And they're going to be looking at me and thinking, "That is one weird Brit woman," you know? Because in Britain, we handle it, it's much easier for me in Britain. It would be something like, "Vicki, your presentation wasn't bad," you know? "Oh, thanks very much." You know, I can handle that. It's easy for me. Or they could say something like, "I managed to this is no problem. I managed to stay awake in your presentation." "Oh, that's good." No problem. So we've got different things going on here. And what it is different politeness rules. There's a social politeness, a social requirement to be agreeable and not disagree with people, and if we disagree, it might suggest that we think the other person is stupid to admire something that we don't. But on the other hand, there's another social requirement to be to appear to be modest. So accepting a compliment might make us appear big-headed. And in some cultures, such as the US, they tend to emphasize agreement, whereas in the UK, we tend to emphasize modesty. And that's what's going on. And like I said, it's just slightly different weightings. So I'm a long way from mastering American compliments myself. And this is some advice that I give my students. And basically, I advise them to come in quick and to just try and say thank you. And I explain that it's basically just a ritual. And it's a handy rule of thumb, these rules that I give them, for the compliment challenge like me, because my Asian students are often compliment challenged in the States as well. But it's actually an oversimplification of what's going on. Americans might think that the polite way to handle a compliment is to say thank you, but conversational research has shown that in practice, about 70% of the time, they don't. Like the rest of us, they have a variety of ways of accepting them as well that can downplay it. But so for example, they might return the compliment, "Oh, I like your earrings too," or they might downgrade the praise so that it seems less important, yes, or they might share the praise, "Oh yes, Tom and Bill helped me do that report," or something like that. But what tends to happen here is that they do seem less likely to disagree. That's what's going on here. Now, a lot of Asian cultures favor negative politeness as well. And there was some wonderful research that was done by someone called Chen. And in Asian cultures, they have a very heavy weighting on modesty. And so this was what Chen managed to uncover in their research. This was an example. "Wow, Zhang, you're looking great." "No, I'm very old and wrinkled." Okay, that response would never cut it in the United States. Okay, now it's not just compliments where I have problems. These politeness rules are operating in all kinds of different speech acts, and it can lead to some different curious misunderstandings. A friend told me a nice story about the Chieftains. I don't know if you remember the Chieftains. They were an Irish traditional folk band, and they had a penny whistle player in the band, and they were on tour in Australia, and their penny whistle player lost the penny whistle. And this is a problem for a traditional Irish band. So an Australian musician, hearing about the problem, heard and said, "Hey, you could have mine if you like." Now the Irish tin whistle player was brought up with a British style of politeness. So he said his response was, "Oh no, I couldn't possibly." And the Australian, brought up with the Australian directness, said, "Oh, okay then." And he never gave him the tin whistle. Confounded by the intricacies of politeness. In some ways, accepting an offer is rather like going into debt. We seem to have all kinds of ways to handle it. Expressing gratitude is key, obviously. But the other thing that can go on is that you can build up the value of the offer. And that's a pretty common strategy. Treat them like they're offering you an unacceptable $1 million instead of a penny whistle. And it will make them feel good. But it's clearly a dangerous strategy to employ in Australia. Another culture where this is quite interesting is Japan. When I lived in Japan, I learnt a little phrase to use when I was giving a gift. And I often had to give my landlady gifts. You know, I'd transgress and do something wrong, and then I'd have to give her a gift. And the phrase went something like, "Tsumaranai mono desu dozo," right? And that means it's a humble little thing, but it's for you. And you even use this phrase if you're giving magnificent gifts, you know, a diamond ring, a Rolls Royce. It's a humble little thing, but it's for you. And there was a ritual that goes with it where the receiver would say, "Iya, iya," and the giver would say, "Dozo, dozo." And it would go on for a long time, "Iya, iya, dozo, dozo." And then eventually there'd be a "domo arigato," and the gift would be accepted. Now, my landlady was a very wise woman, and she recognized the risks that are entailed in cross-cultural communication. And she knew that I may have learnt the phrase to give the gift, but she was never sure that I would know the rest of the ritual. So she never took chances, and I'd say my "Tsumaranai mono desu dozo," and she'd just take the gift. "Domo arigato." I think she'd have thrived in Australia. And while we're on the subject of rituals, there's something that goes on in the United States. If I walk down the street in Philadelphia, quite often, to my surprise, someone will come in, someone, I have no idea who they are, will be walking in and they'll say, "Yo, how's you doing? How's you doing?" or whatever. And this is someone I don't know, you know. Now, in Britain, we wouldn't do that, not to strangers in the street. I mean, these guys are tipping their hats here, but, you know, they've probably been passing one another in the street for 20 years, and that's 20 years is forcing them to acknowledge one another, but otherwise, we avoid eye contact. But in America, it's rather different. So somebody says to me, "Yo, how are you doing?" This is someone I don't know, have never been formally introduced to, I'll never meet them again. Aside from the intrusiveness of the question, do they really want to know? How fake is that? And my students will often say this to me, "You know, Vicki, isn't this fake? What's going on here?" Well, it's as fake as a Tagalog speaker who greets someone with "Where are you going?" and expecting the answer "Over there." or a Taiwanese speaker who greets someone with "Have you eaten yet?" when they've no intention of inviting them to have a meal. What we have here is a ritual. It's just a ritual, and don't let's imagine that Brits don't have their rituals as well. I mean, a very common one in British English would be sorry, you know. We say sorry all the time when we don't mean it. And there's a wonderful experiments that Kate Fox, the anthropologist, did with sorry, where she put a bag over her shoulder and she went around knocking into people in busy, crowded places. And what she found was that in Britain, 80% of English people would say sorry when they had been knocked into. Not the person who fell into them. If she didn't say anything when she fell into them, they would apologize for being in her way, even though it was clearly her fault. And then she went off and she tried it in lots of other countries around the world. And people were very nice, and they'd often say careful or watch out. But the only country that came close to saying sorry was in Japan. But it was very difficult to test the theory in Japan because people were very good at jumping out of the way. So something I've noticed about British and American and offers, thanks, requests and other speech acts, in American, these speech acts are often mitigated by intonation that can leave British people gasping with its ultra politeness. It can sound very over the top to a British ear. You know, would you like me to do that for you? And I'm thinking, oh, that sounds so fake almost. But it used to happen to me when I was in the UK, you know, when I was making audio recordings with American actors in the studio, and I wasn't used to American speech patterns. I would often be saying to them, could you tone it down a little bit for me and sound more matter of fact? But since I've been living in the United States, I haven't had that problem. You know, the American actors will come in and they'll make a recording and it will sound fine first time. And my theory is that either the actors have all come off Prozac, or I've just grown used to it now. And, you know, the intonation patterns have become more familiar to me. Now, there are some curious politeness differences with requests. If I get into a cab and I say to the driver, could you take us to Independence Hall? Then my American friends will say to me, well, of course he could, Vicki, otherwise we wouldn't have got into the cab, you know. So they seem to be more direct than me there. But there are other instances where Brits can seem to be more direct. Let me give you an example. If my American husband, Jay, has cooked our dinner, he might say to me at the end of it, would you like to clear up? Or do you want to clear up? And my response, my natural response is, well, no thanks, I'd like to sit here, carry on drinking on my wine and with my feet up. If he'd said, would you clear up, then the request would have been more obvious to me. So from my perspective, he's the one that's being indirect there. Some of you might know Ken Wilson. He's another ELT writer. And he's British, but his wife is American, Dee Dee is American. So they often have similar conversations, but the other way round in their house. And his wife, Dee Dee, has cottoned on to the fact that if she says to him something like, do you want to do the dishes? Then Ken will say, no. But so she's come up with a new solution. And what she says is, I'll let you do the dishes. Now this sounds really odd to Ken, because it makes it sound like it's something he's been straining at the leash to do all day. Incidentally, for Brits in the audience, if you want to drive an American nuts, then here's what to do. And I think we ought to roll the video if we may. Can we pull it over and start sharing it? Shall I play it, Mercedes? Do I need to move it in? Oh, here we go. Wonderful.
Would you like
So let
tea
me
or
tell
coffee?
I don't mind.
I don't care.
There's a curious difference between British and American English. When there are two alternatives, British and American responses are different. Let's go to the cinema tonight.
You mean the movies?
There's that comedy with Sandra Bullock and that one with Robert De Niro. Which do you fancy?
I don't care.
You don't want to go then?
No, I don't care.
All right then. We won't go.
What did I do? I'm American. I don't care means I like both possibilities. You can decide because I like them both.
I'm British. If you don't care, it means you have no interest in either alternative. You don't like them. I don't care is often rude.
So what do you want for dinner? Spaghetti or an omelet?
I don't mind.
What? It drives me crazy because it makes no sense in American. It's not a logical answer. Would you like red wine or white wine?
I don't mind.
But which do you want?
Okay, we've stopped there. Never mind. I'm just going to carry on. I mean, my response for Jay is very confusing to him because it's a non sequitur. If I say I don't mind, he's left sitting thinking, well, what doesn't she mind? It's just not a natural response in American. Whereas, of course, if I said I don't care, it would sound very disinterested and apathetic to me. I don't want to impose my wishes on you. That sort of implication would be given by I don't mind. So unless you say which one you don't mind, it doesn't make much sense, apparently, in American. Now, I think something like that would be what linguists might describe as a pragma linguistic. I'm going to get a bit technical here, all right? Oh yes, poor Jay. I think something like what's going on here would be described as what linguists might call a pragma linguistic convention. The thing is, there are some differences between British and American English that are just that way because it's how we've encoded the language. There's nothing very deep going on. It's just the way we say it. It's a convention. And then there are other things going on which are to do with, that go much deeper, that they're socio-pragmatic principles. So things like the politeness things are starting to go much more into our different weightings and values that we accord to different things. And of course, it's very hard to tease them apart sometimes. But I just mention this because it's a distinction that's made by researchers. And here's one that I think is possibly a bit deeper that I found quite interesting. Say we have a tax bill to pay. And my husband says, what I really need you to do is to go to City Hall and pay this. And if I'd said it, I probably would have said something like, could you go to City Hall and pay it? But I've noticed this phrase, what I really need you to do is, comes up. And is it that they're being more direct? And I asked, what happens if you take the really out of this? Because what's that word really there, doing there? And Americans will say to me, well, actually, it really makes it more polite. Now, as a Brit, that seems very strange. All it's doing for the Brit is adding urgency. It's adding the importance of doing it. But for an American, it's actually a feature of politeness. And I think what might be going on here is that bumping up the value of what I'm going to do creates a condition where there will be more to appreciate. So you're opening the door to show more appreciation, more gratitude, award more esteem. So positive politeness at work. Just one other thing before we move on from requests. I've been focusing here on the difference between British and American English. And some of the very subtle differences between the forms we choose. But as language teachers, it's important for us to be aware of the similarities, because something peculiar about Anglo-Englishes is that request forms like could you and would you mind and would you like to, and they generally sound pretty weird if you translate them directly into other languages. It's something that English-speaking cultures tend to have in common, that we use these strange request forms, and what's going on here is we seem to like to pretend that people have a choice even when they don't. It's just sort of encoded into the language. It's polite, but it's going to require explanation for our students. Moving on, let's look at sarcasm. It's a tricky concept for a Brit in the United States. Popular wisdom amongst Brits is that Americans don't get it. And popular wisdom amongst Americans is that sarcasm is bad. Yet I still seem to find myself surrounded by it here. So I thought I'd stick my neck out and have a go at explaining it. So, my question for you, are these phrases sarcastic or not? Can you type your answers in the chat, please? Absolutely we get yes. Depends on context, someone says. Yeah. Sure. Okay. I think generally speaking, we can say that in both varieties, these phrases are going to be viewed as sarcastic because we're saying the opposite of what we mean. And that works in both British and American English. Now, what about these phrases? Have a look at these. Are they sarcastic or not? Okay, now we're going to probably find, I think, generally speaking, there will be some British and American differences here, because in American, these phrases are sarcastic, but for British people, probably, I don't think they'd look at them and say they're sarcastic. They might say they're funny, they're witty, but they're not sarcastic, because they're not saying the opposite of what you mean. And so what we've got here is, but for American, they would be classed as sarcastic. I got these phrases from an American website called 75 Great Examples of Sarcastic Phrases, an American website. In both British and American English, we describe remarks as sarcastic when we're saying the opposite of what we mean. But sarcasm has a much broader meaning in American English. It encompasses remarks that wouldn't qualify as sarcastic in the British English sense. In British English, sarcasm might carry negative connotations or it might not. It's a more neutral term. However, many Americans will tell you that the act of sarcasm is frowned on. It's seen as applying to remarks that are mean, that are nasty. However, it's not quite that simple, because amongst the younger generation, it can also be applied to those other remarks we saw that are seen as being witty and funny. Now, the common misperception from Brits that Americans don't get it, in my experience, that's nonsense. I hear Americans employing sarcasm in this way all the time. It surrounds me here. And everybody understands that the other person is saying the opposite of what they mean. And interestingly, because it's understood they're being funny, and because no anger or insult is implied or taken, sometimes Americans might not count it as sarcasm. They'll say, well, it is sarcasm, but technically, but actually it's not. What Americans tend to do is they will add just kidding in a way that we wouldn't in English, British English. So they'll insult you, and it was obvious that it was meant in jest. But then they'll say just kidding, or they'll add a nudge and a wink. And even people I'm really close to will do this. They must know that I know they're not being mean or insulting me. Now for Brits, that's awkward. We think, do they think I'm an idiot because I don't get the joke? And I think what's going on here is we're engaged in different risks when we do this. If we don't explain the joke, then we risk the other person feeling insulted. If we explain the joke, then we risk insulting their intelligence. So what's the lesser of the two evils? So again, we see positive and negative face at work. For Americans, there's a higher value placed on inclusion. So there's bigger social benefits to overtly including the other person in the joke. In Brits, inclusion is less important. We're worried about imposing. If I make a judgment about you, you might not get the joke, but you might not get the joke. That's an imposition. It might insult you. Oh, it's so complicated, this stuff. And when it comes to British and American humour in general, I think it's easy to emphasise the differences, but actually there are an awful lot of similarities as well. Lots and lots of popular comedy shows work on both sides of the Atlantic. And we see satire and sarcasm working, I mean, Borat was a British comedian, Sacha Baron Cohen, going around it's a comedy of social manners. American movie theatres didn't expect it to be popular here, but actually it was the #1 box office hit when it came out in America. So did Americans get the joke? Yeah, they got the joke. And Americans have their own version of satire as well. Brits might not be familiar with this comedian. They might want to look him up. He's an American talk show host. And he actually plays his entire talk show in the role of a right-wing Republican political pundit, even though he's actually a left-wing liberal. It's pure satire. His name is Stephen Colbert. I'm sure some of you will know him and love him, I'm sure. So we see satire and irony and sarcasm alive and well on both sides of the Atlantic. But I think what we do also see is that irony is much more pervasive in British humour. And as Alan Bennett put it, we float in irony. In the UK, there's a lot more ambiguity allowed in British humour. And I'm going to have to finish very quickly, so perhaps, because I would like to take some questions. But in British humour, I think we don't know sometimes ourselves whether we're joking or not. We live in this netherland of joking but not joking, caring but not caring, serious but not serious. I give you an example. I read this exchange. This is a real conversation that took place. B was British, A was American. And you look at it and you think, what would the American have made of this conversation? And I think it could be very hard for an American to understand the Brit's intent here. Is this Brit really that heartless? If the American had said it, they would have said, just kidding. Whereas Brits would register that there's a possibility of a lot of emotion buried under the joke, stiff upper lip and all that. And it doesn't mean that you don't feel you're just in this joking but not joking, caring but not caring state. So, and we live in it in the UK. Sometimes I think we start conversations and we don't decide till partway through whether we're joking or not. We see how they evolve and react to that. And I think this ambiguity allows more cut and thrust in British conversations. So sometimes they can be a lot more hard-hitting and a bit nastier. Backbiting disappeared when I came to the US. But it's more allowable in the UK because there's that possibility for retraction later. The modesty principle is strong in the UK, and it's not that we like nastiness, but we're also more allowed to have a go at somebody if they're too full of themselves. And there's that expression, good old-fashioned British banter, sort of mock impoliteness, which in fact can signal solidarity, but it can also be quite nasty. And we can, the thing is, in the UK there's this social requirement to keep people on a level, but we solve it often by understatement, you know. This is one that did the rounds of the internet. So I'm just going to come to a very quick close here. I haven't had time to say nearly as much and talk nearly as much about a lot of the things that I'd like to, but I really should be getting ready to say my goodbyes because I don't want to impose. So, you know, to all the Brits in the audience, I'd like to say, you know, oopsie daisy, I'd like to say I hope I haven't gone on too long. I hope I haven't wasted your time. Sorry if I have. And to all the Americans, you know, I think you're awesome and thank you very, very, very much. And now perhaps we could look at the chat. So, Marjorie, I don't know if you want to come back on. I know you've got other things as well to say. What have we got here? Do you think that British are less modest on social media? I read lots of posts where people talk about success in ways that I am, as an American, find somewhat boastful. I think I think that modesty is, as I mentioned before, something we value in both cultures, but it's achieved in different ways in both cultures as well, is my short answer to that. How to respond to negative politeness in students responding in the context of hierarchy. Ooh. I think it's worth discussing positive and negative politeness with your students because this is something that they are going to encounter when they go to communicate with other cultures. And very often students are actually learning English to go and speak in situations where English is being used as a lingua franca, the language that's just used as the bridge between lots of different languages, and being aware that these values can operate differently in other cultures is really useful. And Marjorie has said, I also read that men react better to questions with would and women to questions with could. I haven't read that research. I don't know, is my short answer. And another question with prefer and like. An American friend who uses prefer as like. Do you know, I think I might have noticed that prefer is used a little more common. It might be a more frequent word in American English. We'd have to go, there's some very good corpora on that we can check it out. The Brigham Young University has a very good corpora. We would have to go and check out frequency for British and American, but that might well be going on, Rachel. And Rachel has said, oh yes, yeah. Is this all right? Am I doing the right thing going through these questions like this? Okay. I
yes.
can't
I don't know. Can you hear me? My webcam apparently has completely died.
I can
Can
hear
you guys
you,
hear me?
Marjorie.
You can hear me. Okay. I don't know. It just doesn't. It's not reacting in any way, shape, or form. So, not sure what happened here. I'm not sure how many questions were left, Vicki. Were there other questions left?
If there
There
are,
might
I'm
be a
afraid I'm
couple.
not able to scroll down and see them. Oh, there's
The
somebody
last
saying,
one.
Vicki, can you give some more examples of the I don't care, I don't mind? Oh, yes. I mean, you know, if Jay says to me, Vicki, would you like red wine or white wine? It's always a situation where you have an A or a B answer, just two alternatives. And I'll say, I don't mind. And I think that I'm being friendly and helpful and amenable, and you know, I'll go with the flow. Meanwhile, he's thinking, why won't she give me an answer? It's like I'm avoiding him.
We would tend to say make an executive decision in those cases.
Craig's asked, Vicki, do you think the British place more value on or are more proud of their sense of humour? Oh, that's a really good question. I mean, I think in British English, we love to think that we have a good sense of humour. We have the best sense of humour, we love to think. And, well, what country doesn't love to think that? And I think probably what's going on is we might be we might be confusing quantity with quality. But also, I think we have a perception in the UK, because of this ambiguity that I mentioned, that humour is acceptable any place, anywhere. Whereas in other cultures, in most other cultures, they kind of think there's a time and a place for humour, you know. So I've been in queues waiting to get on a plane with lots of Brits passing through security, and they will say, I've heard Brits joking about having bombs in their bags, you know, and other places, other cultures would probably think that's, and certainly Americans would think, you don't joke about having bombs in your bag in the queue at Heathrow. But it was a sort of social reliever of tension for the Brits, you know.
Well,
we have this
yeah,
potential
I actually,
to joke about anything.
a professor of mine at university crossing the border from Canada to Buffalo, who was an American, was asked by the customs why, but his passport said his birthplace was China, and he was asked why, and he said, I wanted to be near my mother. Which would not fit into that, but that sounds like something that maybe you would think someone British would say. And of course they pulled him over and he had to sit there forever. His parents had been missionaries and he didn't go into that. He just made a kind of smart remark. So.
Bill Bryson had a lovely story. As you come into the United States, you pass through the agriculture police who ask you if you've got any fruit or vegetables because you're not allowed to bring them in. And so he was stopped. They said, any fruit or vegetables, sir? And he said, all right, then I'll have a pound of carrots and a couple of bags of potatoes. And the American border guard said, any fruit or vegetables, sir? You know, and you could interpret it as, did he get the joke? And possibly he didn't, but also possibly he did, but he just chose to ignore it because it was deemed inappropriate. I mean, you never really know.
Very possible.
Bill Bryson was probably lucky he didn't come up with another solution of rubber gloves or something to go and check for them. So he
exactly. I think the slide about Scott should be up. I have been trying to turn my webcam on. I no longer, there it is. I can now see it. Are there any other questions that we should answer here? It's a little bit after 5, and we don't want to impose anyone. Could you see? I don't know if there are any other questions that you see there. I mean, you also have a wonderful blog where you could answer some questions, perhaps, if there are some left over. Would that be a possibility?
Absolutely. Please do. Come along to learn to speak American. Yes.
You could send me the link again, and we can put it.
Yeah. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel as well. On YouTube, my username is Vicki Hollet Video. So if you type this in, I'm typing it into the chat. And you'll find more videos. We're going to be making more about living in British and American. And also, my blog is www.merican, with no A, VickiHollet.com.
If you send that to me as an email, we can put it onto the IATEFL website if you want to answer some of these questions that we didn't get to.
One is Vicki Hollet, and that's where I post a lot of the teaching English stuff. And my other Twitter name is @Vicki Videos, and if you'd like to have, I have a cool site for language learners where we have movie trailers and the other videos that we make that we publish on a very regular basis with clickable transcripts, which makes them easy to understand. And I tweet those posts as they go up under Vicki Videos. So
wonderful.
Please join me.
Fantastic. Vicki, thank you so much. This was absolutely great. And it's always fascinating to hear how we use language. And I think so many of us living abroad have also adapted to different places we live, where, those of us I live in Austria, someone living in Germany, we're adapting to the way people here speak as well. So it's really fascinating. Just to let everyone know, the next IATEFL webinar will be with Scott Thornberry on Fossilization is a Terminal. And if that title intrigues you, have a look at the IATEFL website, which will show you what it's about and how to log in. And several SIGs are offering webinars in the near future. There are actually 2 tomorrow. One is with the Global Issues SIG. It's at 10 a.m. GMT, which I believe is 11 o'clock BST, but this has to be checked. And this is on critical language education in a time of crisis. And at 2 p.m. GMT, which is 3 p.m. UK time, the Learning Technology SIG will have one on how to speak meme. And on November 3rd, the Business English SIG has James Schofield on Buy One, Get One Free. In addition, the Business English SIG will be live streaming from the 26th Annual Conference in Prague on November 9th and 10th, and Learning Technologies has an event on the 16th of November and Business English on the 17th. So check the IATEFL website for all of these wonderful webinars coming up. And Vicki, it was awesome. One thing I learned that... Well, I don't know what happened to my camera. I have no idea. It may have just died. But I learned this summer in the States that I should no longer say super, because that apparently is now only said in Austria and Germany, and that it's not said in the States anymore. So I can't tell you it was a super webinar, but it was a truly awesome webinar. And I think everyone who was here totally enjoyed it. It was fantastic. Thank you, Nina, for writing super.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye now. Cheerio, everyone.